The sun hung low over the sprawling city of King's Landing, gilding the red-tiled roofs and high stone walls with a rich golden sheen. A warm wind from the south carried with it the smell of brine from Blackwater Bay, mingling with the more pungent scents of the city. Baked bread and roasting meats from the markets, sweat and waste from the cramped alleyways, and the faint, bittersweet perfume of dying summer flowers in the well-tended gardens of the Red Keep. The bells had begun to toll out the end of another day, sending small folk scurrying toward their homes. In the broader streets, a tension had begun to simmer, an undercurrent of unspoken worry that something was about to happen. It was a feeling that all could sense, from the lowest stable boy to the highest lords and ladies in the city. Wariness hung in the thick evening air. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and newly appointed Hand of the King, moved through the streets accompanied by a handful of his loyal men. The day had been long and full of trials. Unpleasant small council meetings, whispers of intrigues swirling around the court, and the unbearable heat of King's Landing pressing down upon him. His northern blood was not suited to this constant warmth. He longed for the cool breezes of the north, the smell of pine forests, and the distant howl of wolves in the night. But duty had called him south, and he was not one to shirk his responsibilities, even if the city's intrigues threatened to suffocate him. Unbeknownst to him, a storm of swords was forming at that very moment. Word had reached Jaime Lannister, Ser Jaime the Kingslayer, that his brother Tyrion had been taken by Catelyn Stark. The imp was captured on the road, accused of a crime Jaime vehemently insisted Tyrion had not committed. Blood had already been drawn. One of Ned's most trusted men, Jory Castle, had died earlier in a violent clash with the Kingslayer and his retinue. Eddard himself had been injured then, pain lancing through his leg as he recovered from the confrontation. Since that day, the tension between the Hand of the King and the Lannisters had become a tangible entity coiled around every corner of the Red Keep. As Ned and his men navigated the winding streets of King's Landing, they felt it before they saw it. A hush that grew in the throngs of passers-by, parting like a living tide before them. Men, women, and children backed away against walls, scurrying into side alleys. Vendors lowered their voices, or else fell silent entirely, as if the presence of the Lord of Winterfell carried with it some looming sense of foreboding. And then, up ahead, a small group of mounted men appeared, blocking the street. Their cloaks were crimson, emblazoned with the golden lion of House Lannister. At their head was Jaime Lannister himself, mounted on a white charger. The Kingslayer cut a striking figure, golden armor glinting in the dying light, one hand resting on the hilt of his long sword. His green eyes found Ned Stark standing there, and a subtle, predatory smile curled his lips. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, each man aware of how dangerous the next few moments would be. There were too many innocents nearby, too many eyes watching with fear and curiosity. But Jaime had never cared much for what the city folk thought. He had the name of Lannister to shield him, a father who commanded legions of men, and a sister who was queen. He thought himself untouchable. Ned recalled the last time they met like this. He had been caught off guard, Jory Castle slain, and his own leg left bleeding in the dirt. This time, Ned had come prepared. The grief of losing men who had followed him from the north still weighed heavily on his heart, and there was anger simmering in his chest, righteous and cold. This time, if Jaime meant to draw steel, Eddard Stark would not be found wanting. Jaime's voice cut through the quiet. "Have you any word of my brother, my lord?" he asked. The question was edged with mock courtesy. "I would very much like to see him returned, in one piece if possible." He smirked, gloved fingers drumming on his pommel. "Unless, of course, your lady wife has already given him over to her sister's tender mercies." Ned knew too well what Lisa Arryn's so-called tender mercies might be. That was not his main concern at present. His men spread out behind him, each with a hand on the hilt of a sword or the haft of a spear. Jaime's Lannister guards were poised as well, the tension crackling like lightning. Bystanders in the street pressed themselves close to walls, or quickly darted away into shops or alleyways, wanting no part of what was to follow. "I have no further word on your brother," Ned said calmly. "I suggest you ride back to the Red Keep and speak with the king. You've spilled enough blood already. Jaime's grin turned cold. Haven't we all, Lord Stark? Your lady took my brother. I merely sought to learn why and how. He dismounted slowly, a graceful movement belying the lethal potential in his frame. Even on foot, he held himself like a man who had never met his equal in battle. Your men killed some of my own back then, but I'm willing to overlook that if you'll just call your good wife off and see my brother safely returned. Ned felt the throbbing in his leg, scar tissue still sensitive beneath his clothes. I do not answer to threats, Lannister. That was all it took. Jaime's right hand flashed in an instant, drawing his long sword from its scabbard. The steel gleamed cruelly in the amber light. Several of Ned's men unsheathed weapons in response, but Ned himself was a fraction faster. Though his leg ached and his heart thundered, he reached for ice. His ancestral greatsword would have been unwieldy in the cramped street, so instead he settled for the steel at his hip, a more common longsword, but one he wielded with deadly confidence. Jaime advanced, the cunning smirk now replaced with a predator's focus. We do this dance again, Stark, he said. But this time, I won't content myself just to wound you. Ned's eyes flickered toward the watching crowd, the fear in their faces. Your pride has blinded you, Kingslayer, he said. This city is not a battlefield. You risk the lives of innocents. Jaime laughed under his breath. If you truly cared for innocent lives, you'd never have touched my brother. Come, Stark. Let's end this here. One of us will walk away. May as well be me. He lunged. The sharp ring of steel on steel resounded through the narrow street, and the onlookers gasped. Jaime was fast, faster than most men Ned had ever faced in single combat, and supremely confident in his swordsmanship. But Eddard Stark had been trained at a time when the realm was torn by rebellion. He had fought at the Trident and had marched on the Targaryen loyalists. He had dueled men as capable as the great sword of the morning, Ser Arthur Dayne, though not alone. He remembered that the best swordsman in the realm was still mortal, still capable of bleeding. They traded blows, each testing the other's skill, stepping in and out of range with precise footwork. Jaime probed Ned's defenses, hoping to exploit the injury that had left him at a disadvantage the last time. Ned parried and riposted, surprising Jaime by the strength behind his cuts. The street became a ring of steel, onlookers pressing back as if an invisible barrier had erected itself around the two. In his peripheral vision, Ned saw the Lannister men shift as if ready to intervene, and his own men bristled in response. Any second, the conflict could explode into a full melee, but Ned could feel it in Jaime's posture. He wanted the kill for himself. The silver lion embroidered on his cloak fluttered as he spun and slashed, steel humming. Ned blocked high, felt the jarring impact travel up his arm, and responded with a low cut toward Jaime's ribs. Jaime twisted away with effortless grace, bringing his sword in a diagonal slash that Ned barely managed to deflect. A hush fell over the watchers. Even the fishmongers and fruit sellers had abandoned their stalls to gaze, transfixed, upon what was unfolding. The gold in the sky faded, shadows lengthening as the sun sank below the rooftops, leaving a dim glow that caught in the polished metal of the combatants' swords. Jaime feinted right and slashed left, and Ned braced, deflecting the blow with a ringing clash. A trickle of sweat ran down Ned's brow. His leg ached, and he felt the old wound flare, but he held fast. Jaime pressed the advantage, trying to force Ned off balance. Their swords locked for a moment, and their eyes met. Jaime's face, twisted with a warrior's savage intensity, and Ned's, grim and determined. Jaime shoved forward, nearly throwing Ned to the cobblestones. But Ned pivoted on his good leg and hooked Jaime's ankle with a quick step, sending the Kingslayer stumbling slightly. Jaime recovered fast, but not before Ned pressed in with a diagonal cut. Jaime's blade came up to parry, but he was too slow by a hair. Ice-kissed Lannister steel, slid past it, and bit into the flesh of Jaime's right shoulder. A cry of pain erupted from him, and the crowd gasped. Jaime Lannister's eyes went wide in shock, and then narrowed in fury. "You'll pay for that," he hissed, blood already staining his armor. But Ned Stark did not hesitate. He could sense that if he gave the Kingslayer a single heartbeat of time, Jaime would find some opening. So he struck again. This time, he aimed a fierce blow that Jaime tried desperately to block. Jaime managed to angle his sword to catch Ned's steel, but the impact jarred his wounded shoulder, sending a tremor of agony through him. His weapon lowered for the briefest instant, enough for Ned's next cut to slice deep across his chest. Jaime staggered backward, his boots scraping on the uneven cobblestones, gasping as he lost his grip on his sword. The once pristine golden blade rattled on the ground. For the first time in years, Jaime Lannister looked truly afraid. His guards shouted in alarm and moved to close in, but Ned's men were there, holding them back at sword point. The watchers on the street cowered, some turning their heads in horror, others staring in shock at the improbable sight of the Kingslayer near defeat. Ned paused, breathing heavily. He thought of the men Jaime had slain without remorse, Jory Castle among them. He thought of the countless lives destroyed by the Lannister schemes, and of the precarious balance of power in King's Landing. Across from him, Jaime sank to one knee, blood flowing freely from his wounds. Despite that, he still tried to recover his sword, fingers scrabbling at the grip. All it took was a single step forward, and Ned placed his boot on the fallen sword, preventing Jaime from retrieving it. Jaime blinked, betraying a flicker of desperation. "Go on, Stark," he rasped. "Do it. Kill me, and see what lion you wake." Ned stood poised over him. The crowd's hush turned deafening. Across the city, the bells still tolled, marking the passing of time as if in a dream. Ned's leg trembled in pain and exhaustion. His heart pounded in his ears. He saw again the ghosts of the past, the bodies of his father and brother in the throne room of the Mad King, the rebels who died at the Trident, the horrors of war that he had always tried to shield his children from. He thought of the promise he had made to his own men, to keep them safe, to stand for justice. In the hush, Eddard Stark drove his sword forward and plunged it through Jaime Lannister's chest. The golden lion died with a gasp. Jaime's eyes widened, and then his body slumped onto the stained cobblestones. A strangled cry of horror and fury rang out among the Lannister guards as their lord's lifeblood spilled onto the ground. The Kingslayer was dead. No one moved for a heartbeat. Then chaos erupted. Lannister men surged forward, weapons raised in vengeful fury, but Ned's men met them in a clash of steel. Screams echoed off the walls. City folk tripped over each other in their desperation to flee. Ned stood over Jaime's body, torn between the impulse to keep fighting and the weight of what he had just done. He had killed a Lannister, brother to the Queen, son of Lord Tywin Lannister, in the very streets of the capital. In his heart, Ned knew that he might have just doomed them all to an even bloodier conflict. But for a moment, that knowledge was overtaken by grim satisfaction. The man who had murdered his trusted guards, the man who threatened to unravel the kingdom with his arrogance, lay dead at his feet. The carnage around him felt inevitable now. Swords clanged and rang, men cursed and screamed, steel bit flesh and bone. In the flurry, Ned's men gained the upper hand by virtue of position and readiness. Half of Jaime's retinue broke and fled, dragging wounded companions with them. The rest perished in the street, bodies scattered among upturned carts and splashes of blood. At last, the fighting ceased. Some of Ned's men had cuts and bruises, but none looked gravely wounded. They gazed at their lord with a mixture of respect and dread, for they knew as well as Ned did the price that might be paid for Jaime Lannister's death. Ned nodded once to them, breathing heavily, and then pressed his lips into a stern line. He turned to the small folk who remained cowering by the walls. "Find the city watch," he said, voice carrying authority. "Let them know I will speak with them in the Red Keep. None shall harm you for bearing witness." Some nodded shakily. Others rushed away, glancing back at the fallen Lannister lion with wide, terrified eyes. Ned looked upon Jaime's body one more time. His own blade dripped with blood. Blood was spattered across the once clean cobblestones, congealing in the heat. A single ray of the dying sun glinted on Jaime's open, sightless eyes. The ephemeral beauty of King's Landing's twilight had been replaced with an ugly brutality. Ned exhaled, kneeling down for a moment. "May the gods have mercy," he murmured, but even as he said it, he felt uncertain which gods might heed that prayer. He rose, grim and burdened by his choice, and commanded his men to follow him back to the Red Keep. Silence like the hush before a storm gripped the onlookers as they made their way through the streets, the stench of blood clinging to them. The city would not remain silent for long. By the time Ned and his men approached the Red Keep's gates, the news had outrun him. A swirl of anxious activity churned in the castle courtyard. Gold cloaks of the city watch stood uncertainly, forming lines at the gates while red-cloaked Lannister guardsmen glared and muttered from across the yard. Servants of the keep hustled to and fro, faces etched with worry, glancing at Ned as if he were a walking ghost. Within minutes, he found himself confronted by the startled master of arms, men from the Kingsguard, and a handful of others demanding an explanation. It was not until King Robert arrived in the courtyard, accompanied by Queen Cersei, that the clamor reached a fever pitch. Robert Baratheon wore a simple tunic, his hair disheveled, as though he had been roused abruptly from a drunken nap. Cersei, on the other hand, had donned a crimson gown with gold filigree, her hair impeccably arranged despite the frantic circumstances. Her green eyes burned with fury. The moment she saw Ned, her face twisted into hatred barely contained by courtly propriety. "Is it true?" King Robert demanded, his voice booming over the throng. "Jaime gone?" He looked almost disbelieving, like a man told the sun had fallen from the sky. Cersei's voice dripped venom. "He's murdered my brother in the streets, Your Grace. The hand of the king has committed treason. He must be punished." Ned took in a slow breath. He felt the eyes of the entire courtyard upon him. The shock in some faces, the confusion in others, and the rage in those loyal to House Lannister. But Robert Baratheon's expression was a more complicated mixture. Grief, anger, and an echo of the old friendship he once shared with Ned's sister, Lyanna. You killed Jaime?" Robert asked, as if the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "It was not my wish to draw steel," Ned said, meeting Robert's gaze. "He gave me no choice. He came at me seeking blood, as he did when he slew my men. I defended myself. He would have killed me had I faltered." Laughter free of mirth burst from Cersei's lips. "You lie," she spat. "The Kingslayer had the right to avenge our family after your wife abducted my brother. You—" "Silence!" Robert roared, and for a moment, even Cersei fell quiet, though her glare told that this was far from over. The king waved an arm to quiet the onlookers. "We will speak of this in private," he declared. "All of you, back to your duties. Lord Stark, you will come with me. The rest of you out." Cersei's lips thinned, but she did not argue openly. The courtyard began to clear, though the tension pulsed in the air. The Lannister guards bristled, uncertain whether to obey the king or their mistress, but a sharp glare from Robert made them back down. Ned gestured to his own men to stand at ease, though they watched warily, hands on hilts, prepared for any renewed violence. Moments later, in a council chamber lit by flickering torches, Ned stood opposite Robert. Cersei paced near the window, raking her manicured nails along the sill. She looked ready to commit violence herself, if only she had a weapon. A hush weighed upon the room, thick with unresolved fury and sorrow. Robert slumped into a chair, pressing a hand to his temple. He stared at Ned for a long moment. "Gods, Ned," he said softly. "Jaime might have been a prideful ass, but he was my queen's brother, Tywin Lannister's eldest son. This will have consequences." Ned braced himself. "I will accept the consequences," he said firmly. "He killed my men without cause. He provoked me again and attacked me in the street. I did what I had to do." Cersei whirled around, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "You have doomed us all. My father will never suffer this insult. He'll raise an army, perhaps half the realm, to lay waste to your precious north." Her eyes glistened, though with anger or grief Ned couldn't be certain. "And what of me? You have robbed me of a brother. You—" "Stop," Robert commanded in a low voice, though it was no less potent for being quiet. Cersei glared, her chest rising and falling, but she fell silent. Robert looked at Ned with pained eyes. Treason or not, the realm will see it as a brazen act against the Lannisters. I'll have no choice but to pass judgment, even if you are my friend. Ned's mouth was dry. He could see the conflict tearing at Robert. If the king spared Ned, House Lannister might well brand him a traitor to the crown and rally support from powerful lords who feared Tywin's wrath. But if Robert punished Ned, how would the realm respond to the king condemning his own hand, a man beloved in the north, for defending himself against the man who had already killed Ned's men? Before Robert could speak again, the doors burst open without warning, and in strode Lord Peter Baelish, followed closely by Varys the Spider, who glided in with soft footsteps. Their faces were guarded, watchful,